Good evening. I'm Shelley Fisher-Fishkin. I'm a professor of English and director of American Studies at Stanford. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you this evening on behalf of the English Department, Creative Writing Program, the American Studies Program, and the Stanford Arts Institute. We're going to hear some very beautiful music this evening, and to allow us to enjoy it without interruption, would you please take a moment to turn off your cell phones? Thank you. What a special treat to bring the Golden Gate back to the campus where it was born. Serendipity plays a much larger role in our lives than we tend to recognize. If a former Stegner Fellow and graduate student in economics named Vikram Seth hadn't wandered into the Stanford bookstore early one morning in the 1980s and come across a book that set his imagination on fire, we wouldn't be here this evening. And if the fortuitous events that led to such a fruitful collaboration between this gifted writer and an equally gifted composer, Conrad Cummings, hadn't transpired, we wouldn't be here either. We're grateful to the co-sponsors who helped make tonight's event happen: the Music Department, the Department of Theater and Performance Studies, the programs in Feminist Studies and Asian American Studies, and the Institute for Diversity in the Arts. Many individuals contributed their talents and energies, but I'd particularly like to thank the multi-talented Chayuma Elliott, a Stegner Fellow whose enthusiasm for this project from the start was key. I'd also like to thank our indefatigable undergraduate production assistants, Aisha Qureshi and Brittany Newell, for their tremendous help, as well as Gavin Jones, English Department Chair, and Dagmar Logie of the English Department for all of their support. We have a wonderful cast of Stegner Fellows and Stanford students whom you'll meet in a moment. We've also had a really dedicated group of understudies who I want to recognize for their help with making this project happen. We're delighted that a Stanford graduate, the accomplished director, John Henry Davis, agreed to direct this evening's presentation. And we are thrilled that Conrad Cummings, whose wonderfully imaginative musical vision set it all in motion, is here to share with us the magical alchemy by which he transformed a celebrated lyric novel into a lyric opera that has been named one of the best operas of the 21st century. We are going to be filming this evening's presentation, and eventually it will be available on the English Department's website. And after this evening's event, all of you are invited to chat with the composer, the director, and the cast in a reception that will be held in the lobby right outside this room. Enjoy. Thank you.
Hello. Welcome all of you to this evening's event, from lyric novel to lyric stage. I'm Vikram Seth. Many years ago, when I was a student at Stanford, in fact, I wrote this novel, The Golden Gate, part of which we'll hear, versions of which are in the offing in the form of an opera by Conrad Cummings. And part of this evening's exploration, I suppose, is to see how something written in one form can be converted, adapted, in some senses enriched by its conversion into a different medium. I was a student here in the Department of Economics, in fact, and I don't think I'd have written this novel if it hadn't been for the fact that after a whole late night of data entry, I wandered into the Stanford bookstore and chanced upon, because I thought there had to be some sort of life beyond data entry, I chanced upon two quite different translations of Pushkin's Eugene Onegin, a wonderful novel in verse. I'd never read a novel in verse before, and this so captured my imagination and fancy that I just decided to put my economics dissertation aside for a while and begin writing what turned out to be The Golden Gate, set not in St. Petersburg in the earlier part of the 19th century, but in San Francisco and the Bay Area in the latter half of the 20th. Now, it wasn't as if I'd never written poetry before. I had, and in fact, this evening's readings are going to be done by Stegner Fellows in the English Department. I too was a Stegner Fellow for my third year at Stanford. I took time out from economics to do that, and it gave me that breathing space that I needed to, in a sense, concentrate my energies and enthusiasms for a very different endeavor than that of writing an economics dissertation set in China. And many years later, when I came to write the Golden Gate, I think a lot of what I learned during that period kicked in. So I'm very grateful, in fact not only to Stanford as a university that sustained me and also sent me on the wrong path into economics, but also to Stanford in its flexibility, in that it managed to keep me out of the way of my economics tutor for a long time, and also gave me the chance to spend a year as a Stegner Fellow. I hope, I won't say anything further. I'm delighted that Conrad is in the process of making this book into an opera. In a funny way, he spent more time with it than I have. It took me 13 months, and he's been at it for a longer time. Music requires that kind of, I suppose, concentration. But he'll tell you about that, and this will be part of the process of this evening. So without further ado, let me welcome you to from lyric novel to lyric stage, and say goodbye to you from afar.
It's an honor to follow Vikram. How do you respect and love a great novel, in this case a novel in verse, and at the same time make it live and breathe on the lyric stage? To answer this question, we'll move between words seen on the page and spoken, and words sung and action seen on stage. For spoken words, our wonderful team of Stanford poets and readers, may I introduce Wallace Stegner Fellows Yuma Elliott, Dana Koster, Keith Eckes, and Stanford students Graham Spencer Roth and Erica G. And for song, we'll have a video of a staged workshop of the opera that was presented at Lincoln Center. Let's start with the beginning.
To make a start more swift than weighty, hail muse. Dear reader, once upon a time, say circa 1980, there lived a man. His name was John. Successful in his field, though only 26. Respected, lonely.
One evening, as he walked across Golden Gate Park, the ill-judged toss of a red frisbee almost brained him. He thought,
if I died, who'd be sad? Who'd weep? Who'd gloat? Who would be glad? Would anybody?
As it pained him, he turned from this dispiriting theme to ruminations less extreme.
A novel begins with the turn of a page, a field of white, and those first 14 lines. How does an opera begin?
Successful in his work, though only 26. Respected, lonely. One evening as he walked across Golden Gate Park,
the misjudged toss of a red frisbee nearly brained him.
he thought, if I died, who'd be sad? Who'd weep, who'd gloat, who would be glad?
Well, we learn some things before the first character even sings. These are a group of friends, not strangers. 4 of them know each other very well. The music, you could say, is cocky, but there's also a touch of melancholy. There's direct address to the audience. The music and the other 4 characters do not take John's loneliness very seriously, even though John certainly does. You probably noticed that the first line of the novel is left out, but not really. The jaunty music that opens the piece sings the first line, "To make us start more swift than weighty." So you heard it. By the way, in this workshop, the piano is the stand-in for a 17-piece orchestra. Let's see what happens next.
He tuned his thoughts to electronic circuitry. This soothed his mind. He left irregular, moronic, sentimentality behind. But as flights of silhouetted birds move cawing across the pine-serrated sky, dragged from his cove, not knowing why, he feels an urgent riptide drawing him far out, where caught in the curb of loneliness, he cries for help.
And here's the next verse as it appears in the novel.
He tuned his thoughts to electronic circuitry. This soothed his mind. He left irregular, moronic sentimentality behind. He thought of OR gates and of AND gates, of ROMs, of NOR gates and of NAND gates, of nanoseconds, megabytes, and bits and nibbles.
But as flights of silhouetted birds move cawing across the pine-serrated sky, dragged from his cove, not knowing why, he feels an urgent riptide drawing him far out, where, caught in the kelp of loneliness, he cries for help.
So there are 2 new tones in this stanza, both of which immediately invite music. For John's technical, less extreme ruminations, the jaunty music of the opening turns stiff and brittle. And then there's the flight of silhouetted birds. The music is much more serious. It now comes very much from John's painful interior. The novel goes to some length now to fill in the backstory. On stage, we already sense a lot of it, and anything we don't know will be filled in later. So instead, we jump through 23 stanzas ahead to a rollicking release of tension. Jan and John at lunch in a bustling Chinese restaurant in the Mission. It starts with Jan talking.
Think of yourself a few years later, possessing, as the years go on, less prepossessing vital data. Love handles.
Thanks a lot, says John.
Receding.
John is getting nervous. More rice? I wonder when they'll serve us.
Hairline.
Funny taste, this tea. He sips at it distractedly.
Lonely and lost. Son's love, son's lover. Too much to drink last night. And here Jen pauses for a sip of beer. Nursing the dregs of your hangover, blubbering into your raisin bran. Why not do something while you can?
Yikes. We have direct address by Jan, both spoken and unspoken responses from John, plus descriptions of their actions. Okay, you could just strip it down to the direct dialogue, but then you lose that whole crazy, bustling atmosphere. Here's how it goes on stage.
Yes, alas, says John.
John is getting nervous.
Or right, someone would not serve us.
Dear mine.
Any taste of this tea?
He sips at it distractedly.
Lonely and lost, son's lover, too much to drink last night.
And here, gent office for a sip of beer.
Nursing the dregs of your hangover, blubbering into your raisin bran. Why not do something while you can?
Well, there's so much going on that you maybe didn't notice that musically the whole scene is carried by one simple repeating instrumental riff. It's a conscious trade-off. Any more musical complexity and you wouldn't be able to follow all the different voices and interjections and interruptions. Next, we learn something about Jan. Here are two stanzas from that earlier part of the chapter.
He phones Phil, the first time in ages, but there's no answer. Friday night.
He idly thumbs the scribbled pages of his address book. Well, he might phone Janet Hayakawa. Many seasons have sunk since there was any hazard a meeting could adduce their former love. A standing truce shelters their friendship from all passion.
They'd felt their union would constrict their separate lives. An interdict agreed by both. After a fashion, they went about their singular ways, slaves to the chip or artist's days.
She is a sculptor. Stress and pleasure for her thus perfectly combined. The boundaries of toil and leisure, by definition ill-defined, her work time doubles as her playtime.
But hand and eye, deployed in daytime, yield, when night comes, to ear and hand. She is the drummer in a band, well known and feared throughout the city.
The striking sounds of liquid sheep rouse distant suburbs from their sleep. Unlinked alike to tune or ditty, their music is a throttled yelp, Morse crossed with a pig's squeal for help.
A tiny number of lines from these two stanzas and from a third one make up the lyrics for what comes next. They also gave me an opportunity to channel Black Flag for a couple of moments. One of the great things about opera is that the same line can be sung twice. If it's done right, you learn something new in the repetition. You might want to watch what happens with the line after a fashion. It shows something quite different when it's sung the second time.
Many seasons have sunk since their former love.
A standing truce shelters their friendship from all passion.
Agreed by both after a fashion.
After a fashion.
At midnight she cannot sleep.
Janet's arm hurts.
She is a sculptor.
When night comes,
She is a drummer in a band.
liquid sheep.
Well known and feared throughout the city.
The striking sounds of liquid sheep.
Rouse distant suburbs from their sleep.
Let's jump ahead now. We'll skip over the part where Jan decides to write a personal ad for John, his indignant reaction, and for all lovers of the book, those fabulous sequence of totally doomed dates, each one more hilarious than the last. Here we are in the middle of chapter 2 at the Café Trieste in North Beach.
At noon, the meeting hour appointed, a tall, fresh-faced blonde enters, sees the suited John. Excuse me, please, a little hesitant and disjointed. Would you be John?
John smiles. Correct. And you're Elizabeth, I suspect? She's lovely, John thinks, almost staring. They shake hands. John's heart gives a lurch.
Handsome, all right. And what he's wearing suggests he's just returned from church. Sound, solid, practical, and active, thinks Liz. I find him quite attractive, perhaps.
The pair are now wrapped in discussion. Jan comes in, sees them, cannot hear what they are saying, could be Russian for all she knows. She does not steer too close, takes in the situation, sees John's face boyish with elation, while Liz, who's she, with vibrant verve in an exhilarating curve of explication or description, looks radiant. Jan reflects. Somehow I feel, oh Christ, I feel right now I don't want coffee.
How could John know that Liz Dorati, ex-Stanford Law School, last year's batch, is neither cool, nor stern, nor hearty, and much sought after as a match by more than one well-heeled attorney at the staid law firm, Cobb and Kearney?
Daily, their sheepish, prurient eyes swerve from their statutes to her thighs. Unmoved by this redundant bounty, Liz spends her weekends at her folks', a vineyard where she reads and soaks the sunlight of Sonoma County.
There must be some happy medium between a legal partner's life and being a legal partner's wife.
Lines from these four stanzas get rearranged for two goals. Of course, to move the action forward, and also to reveal characters' connections. John and Liz's immediate chemistry, Jan's unvoiced but powerful continuing attraction to John.
Would you be John?
Correct. And you'd be Elizabeth, I suspect. She's lovely.
They shake hands.
John's heart gives a lurch.
And so, all right. And what he's wearing suggests he's just returned from church. Sound, solid, practical, and active. Perhaps.
Jan comes in. Oh Christ!
Who's she?
Liz Dorati,
Ex Stanford Law School,
Cobb and Kearney,
much sought after,
by more than one,
well-heeled attorney,
a legal partner's wife,
spends her weekends at her folks',
like her brother Ed,
a vineyard,
where she reads
and soaks
the sunlight.
of Sonoma County.
Sometimes it's really sad to analyze humor. It's fun, though, to create it and watch the effect on an audience. So let's take a quick look at the mechanics of it in this scene, and then do our best to forget about it afterwards. The humor starts with the rhyme. John's heart gives a lurch. What John's wearing suggests he's just returned from church. Lurch and church could not be more different in meaning and association, so it tickles our brains that they sound so alike. And like the best of rhymes, we register it unconsciously. Then there's Liz singing her line to Protestant hymn music, but the reason for that music only becomes clear on the last word. And people usually laugh. I love it. A nighttime drive through the city brings our newly minted lovers to the tower on Telegraph Hill.
The night is cold. It's late November. They stand close, shivering side by side, chilled by the ice cream. Yet an ember, a flare, ignited by the ride. This staring at the lights together defends them from inclement weather. They stand, half shivering, half still, below the tower on Telegraph Hill, not speaking, with a finger tracing the unseen lines from star to star. Liz turns. They kiss. They kiss. They are caught in a panic of embracing. They cannot hold each other tight enough against the chill of night.
Okay, it's an opera, so this is clearly the place for the first big love duet. And this is where, in a traditional libretto, the two lovers would have a lot to say to each other, or to sing to each other. But they're silent, not speaking, it even says. Will it work to have a love duet where the lovers simply describe their actions? This is a question I grappled with for a long time, and you see what you think. But before we do that, I want to let you in on a little trade secret. The texture of the music through the duet you're going to see is quite consistent, but there's a secret switch from 5 beats to 6 beats per measure when they finally kiss. That's what's behind the feeling of release and expansion that happens at that moment. See how it strikes you. Ideally, the effect is unconscious, but sometimes it's fun to know what's going on.
The night is cold.
It's late November.
They stand close,
Shivering side by side. Yet an ember of flame ignited by the ride, is staring at the lights together. Defends them from inclement weather.
they stand,
Half shivering,
half still
below the tower on Telegraph Hill. Not speaking,
with a finger tracing the
unseen lines from star to star.
It's
They kiss, they are caught in a panic of embracing. They cannot hold each other tight enough against the chill of night.
Okay. Now the scene shifts to Phil and his son Paul on a golden hillside above the Stanford campus.
Paul says, "Dad, get a spider for us as a pet." "No." "Why not?" "Spiders have weird habits." "I like them." "I don't." "I do." "Let's get something we both like rabbits." "Why rabbits, Dad?" "They make great pets. Your mother used to like..." Phil falters, halts in mid-utterance, and alters what he had meant to say. "Well, son, you want a spider? We'll get one. Put on your coat now."
As they linger, Paul sees a green patch on the plain. A field? A lake when filled with rain. And that? Paul points a questioning finger at Stanford's roofs of clay-baked red. A school. You talk like Mom is dead.
Such thoughts melt through the frozen river of his sad mind, and yet out loud, seeing Paul quietly weep and shiver, he says, taut-featured, head half bowed, "No, Paul, she's gone away. Forever? I just can't tell you, son."
In the opera, it's a spoken scene, but the music plays a big part.
Dad, get a spider for us as a pet.
No.
Why not?
Spiders have weird habits.
I like them.
I don't.
I do.
Let's get something we both like. Like rabbits.
Why rabbits, Dad?
Rabbits make great pets. Your mother used to like. Put on your coat now.
You talk like Mom is dead.
No, Paul. She's gone away.
Forever?
I just can't tell you, son.
Always get a little choked up over that one. You may wonder why music that's reminiscent of Brahms' string quartet underlies Paul's unspoken grief and rage. It's because what happens next is that Liz and John go to a quartet concert at Dinkelspiel, Bing's distinguished predecessor, where they run into Phil, who was John's college roommate, and Paul. After the intermission, it's the Brahms A minor.
The lights have dimmed. Now they're returning. Throats clear. Brahms A minor begins. The brisk allegro. Then a yearning, warm, ductile length of lyrics spins its lovely glimmering thread at leisure, inveiglingly, from measure to measure with a continuous tenderness so deep it smooths out all distress, all sorrow. Ravishing, beguiling, and on, till silence comes. Paul whispers, "That's the tune Mom hums." Phil's eyes are closed, but Paul is smiling, floating on a slow tide of Brahms, back in his absent mother's arms.
The lights have dimmed. Now they're returning. Roads clear. Brahms A minor begins. The brisk allegro, then a continuous tenderness, so deep it smooths out all distress. Till silence all sorrow ravishing beguiling, and on till silent Paul whispers, that's the tune, Moll
The music for the aria is all derived from the Brahms quartet, though little of it is directly quoted. The saddest and the most painful of the music, what underlay Paul's outburst on the hillside, now conveys Phil's sense of loss. For both of them, though, the music is also a consolation. Liz and John throw a housewarming party at their new San Francisco flat and invite Phil. There he meets Liz's younger brother, Ed. Phil's too drunk to drive home to Palo Alto, so he crashes at Ed's apartment in the outer Sunset.
Phil's bleary eyes rest on a bowl of fruit, a crucifix, a roll of film, a photograph of Lana Turner, who smiles across the floor at Holbein's sketch of Thomas More. My patron saint. Which one? Ed, grinning, says, go to sleep, and turns to pray. He asks forgiveness for his sinning, gives thanks for the expended day, consigns his spirit to God's charity.
Now Philip, with exiguous clarity and some bewilderment, sees Ed cross himself twice, then come to bed. Lights out. Phil mumbles, "What a party. I really blew it then with Jan. Ed, thanks a lot. I mean it, man. I haven't yet met a Dorati I didn't like." Across the bed, he reaches out and touches Ed. "Good night."
Ed fears to answer. Trembling, he moves his hand across the space. What terrifying miles! Assembling his courage, touches Philip's face and feels him tense up and go rigid. "I'm sorry," Ed says in a frigid, half-choking voice. "I thought you might... I didn't mean... I mean... Good night."
Taut with a cataleptic tension, they lie, unspeaking. Phil thinks, why be so uptight? He's a great guy. I've never bothered with convention. God. It's been a year that I've been chased. And puts his arm around Ed's waist.
Now, just as things were getting tenser and Ed and Phil were making love, the imperial official censor, officious and imperious, drove his undiscriminating panzer straight through the middle of my stanza. Now, gentle reader, is it right this swine should put my muse to flight, rooting about among my pearly wisdom till he finds orts that he can gobble down with grunting glee? Forgive me, reader, if I'm surly at having to replace the bliss I'd hoped I could portray with this.
The tension is palpable. There's one single line for the moment of release, and then it's on to this maddening, though quite funny, act of self-censorship, which I remember being very mad about when I first read the book. But this love duet is just as central to the action of the story as John and Liz's. What to do? Let's just say that desperation led to invention, along with the realization that everyone is wrapped up in everyone else's life in this piece, and that there are a couple of words that were able to carry more than one meaning. Thank God Vikram loved the result.
I'm plastered.
You're right.
I'm going home.
I'll drive you home.
I live near Stanford, Ed.
Then share my bed instead.
Ed yawns.
Silence outside.
A bowl of fruit, a crucifix, a roll of film.
A photograph of Lana Turner.
Who smiles across the floor?
Whole blind sketch of Thomas More, my patron saint.
Which one?
Go to sleep.
Ed turns to pray, crosses himself twice, and comes to bed. What a party. I really blew it then with Jan. Ed, thanks a lot. I need it, man. haven't yet met a Dorati I didn't like.
Across the bed he reaches out and touches Ed.
Good night.
They lie unspeaking.
Ed moves his hand across.
I didn't mean. I mean. Good night.
Taut with a cataleptic tension. They lie still. Phil thinks, why be so uptight? He's a great guy. God, it's a year that I've been chased.
Why be so
It's a year
uptight? He's a great
I've been
guy.
chased.
Why be so
It's a year
uptight? He's a great guy.
his arm.
He's a great, so uptight.
God, it's a guy. It's a year.
Why be so
He's a great,
What's his
chased?
a guy?
Why be so
uptight.
Waste. It's a waste.
So uptight. He's a guy.
It's a waste that I'm chased. I've his arm around. God, it's so tight. It's at waist that I'm chased. And his arm touches and good night. I didn't mean his arm. God, his waist. God, his arm. God, night. God, it's so and it's so filled. It's his arm. It's my waist. I mean chased across. It's his waist. It's so round. It's so great. I mean arm. I mean waist. I mean chase. I haven't met my soul. I still. God, he's a great time when shake us. God, I've never bothered with convention. It's a year that I've been chased. And puts his arm around and
Okay, we're a third of the way through the opera. The relationships between the five characters are established. So is the range between faithfulness and freedom in the adaptation of the novel's language. We'll jump ahead now to the end of the first act. All is not well. Liz and John's relationship is frayed and fragile. Phil and Ed's is done for. Jan is ignored by everyone. John freaks out when he learns that Phil had a relationship with Ed. This drives Liz crazy. She and Phil drive down to the marina. All five, from their separate places, look at the bridge. The music is as much about the place as it is about them, the sense of space and breath. Sometimes I think San Francisco is a character in the opera. It certainly is in the novel. And me? Just poor emigre to the East, passionately nostalgic for his place of birth and growing up.
They park the car by the marina. The surface of the Cobalt Bay is flecked with white. The moister, keener October air has rinsed away the whispering mists with crisp intensity, and over the opaque immensity, a deliquescent wash of blue reveals the bridge, long lost to view in summer's quilt of fog.
The towers, high built, red gold with their long span, the most majestic spun by man, whose threads of steel through mists and showers, wind, spray, and the momentous roar of ocean storms link shore to shore.
They park the car by the marina. The surface of the cobalt bay is flecked with white. The moist and keen October air has rinsed away the whispering mist with crisp intensity. Long lost to view in summer's quilt of fog, the tower I built red gold with lead sand, the most majestic sun by whose threads of steel through mists and showers, wind, spray, and the momentous roar of ocean storms, they shore to shore.
So we're on to the second act now. It opens with a wedding, but we're not exactly sure who's getting married. Guess what? It's Liz and Phil. John is shattered by Liz's rejection and feels betrayed by Phil. He drowns himself in work and one-night stands from singles bars. Jan drags him out to have coffee at the Cafe Trieste in North Beach. In some lucky spots, there's a single stanza that totally encapsulates a dramatic moment. The setting is vivid, the relationship between the characters is at an important tipping point, and one character in the middle of a public moment reveals her most private thoughts. This is one of those lucky spots. And at the end of the aria, the music needs time to breathe, and it's an invitation for the singing actors and the director to show through actions things that don't yet fit into words.
So there they sit. And John is smiling, and Jan is not. And John says, "Jan?" And Jan thinks, he's forever riling me. Why don't I dislike this man? Politically, he's close to Nero. For tolerance, he scores a 0, despite his catacombs of books. Am I just turned on by his looks? At one time, I was mad about him. Still, we broke up, and time slipped by, and I'm still here. In those days, I could hardly think of a life without him. Poor Jan, she thinks. I wish I could have been there. I'd have done me good.
So there they sit, and John is smiling,
And Jan is not.
and John says,
And Jan thinks he's forever riding me. Why don't I dislike this man? Politically, he's close to Nero. For tolerance, he's close to zero. Dislike is mechanical to books. Am I just turned on by his looks? At one time I was mad about him. Still, we broke up and time slipped by, and I'm still here. In those days I could hardly think of life without him. Poor Jan, she thinks. Poor Jan. I wish I could have been there. I have done me good.
John and Jan reconnect in leisurely weekend days spent together. A canceled performance by Jan's band leaves her at home one night, and she invites John to dinner.
She yells a cheerful, "I'm just coming," runs down the stairs, 2 at a time, hugs him, and with unconscious drumming, chisel on door, remarks, "John, I'm sorry. I'm in the very middle of, it's that hen. She's such a riddle. Go, take a walk around the block and come back here at 8 o'clock.
John thinks, she hasn't changed much, really, in all these years. When he returns, they eat and talk, and John's heart burns with an old longing. Is it merely night, or her unchanged waywardness? And he says, Jan. And she says, yes.
Tonight, a quilt of peace surrounds him. He dreams of nothing. He is free of all volition. It astounds him how little now the enmity of the crass world, its fickle illness, impinges on his crypt of stillness.
He sleeps, his cheek against her breast, unagitated, more at rest than when the sensual excitement of strangers' lovemaking endured. He flees to sleep with no accord between release and the indictment his heart makes, that his love hard sealed with bitterness, rots unrevealed.
Yet tender as is their love-making, John gives his voice no leave to own what his hands touch, what his lips quaking, unknown perhaps to him, has shown more forthrightly than declaration.
And if Jan's heart knows the elation it knew 6 years ago when they were lovers, She does not betray by open word for fear of sweeping a turbid patina of dust on the clean fabric of their trust, that as her heart was in his keeping once, and the sharer of his pain and gladness, so it is again.
It's beautiful. It's one of the most important moments in the whole story, and there's absolutely no way it can become a love duet as it stands. This is actually some of the very last music I composed for the opera, when my wonderful production team, and particularly director John Henry Davis, pointed out that there wasn't yet a full musical moment of love for these two characters. What I figured out was, in the times between sleep and wakefulness, half thoughts and half phrases can come and go. And it's at those moments that a couple in tune with each other can slip into lovemaking. So, fleeting fragments from these three stanzas, jumbled, half-finished thoughts, are sung over music as steady as a lover's breathing during deep sleep.
Tam, who can that be? Oh, John, of course. How dumb of me. Jan, you're the cheerful, I'm just coming, runs down the stairs, two at a time. Off John and with unconscious drumming.
She's on board.
Remarks. John, I'm sorry, I'm in the very middle of. It's that head, she's such a riddle. Go take a walk around the block and come back here at 8 o'clock.
John thinks she hasn't changed much really in all these years. Her calm beauty, her dark eyes, her vagrant charm.
When he returns, they eat and talk.
And John's heart burnt with an old longing. Is it merely night, or her unchanged waywardness? And he says, Jan.
And she
Jan throws a party in her North Beach studio, and she invites Liz and Phil, hoping to effect a reconciliation between them and John. But delivering a sculpture takes her down to Stanford, and she's late to her own party.
Jan's absent, but her party's swinging. Funny that no one seems to care, John muses. Now the phone is ringing, whether or not the host is there. He squeezes through the reveling fever toward the phone, lifts the receiver. Yes? Hayakawa? What? Police? All sounds around him swiftly cease. Phil looks at John, eyes closed and gasping as if for life and breath. He stands, the Mickey Mouse phone in his hands, reiterating without grasping 3 words that gradually sink in as he repeats them. Next of kin?
A month has passed. The moon is rising. A balmy night in late July rests on the city, exorcising the summer fog. Around the sky, the great imputed constellations, differently seen by different nations, and that great current over all that Janet's grandmother would call the Silver River, faintly glowing, counter the city's glittering grid. The Transamerica Pyramid spears up in light. A breeze is flowing, quiet as love that's left unsaid through the straight streets. And Jan is dead.
Jan's absent, but her party's swinging.
Funny, no one seems to care.
Now the phone is ringing.
Whether or not the host is there.
John squeezes through the reveling fever from the phone, lifts the receiver. Yes, Hayakawa. What? Police? All sounds around him swiftly cease.
Sometimes a text is a gift. It tells you how to write the music. It almost hands you the music itself. That's how this one was. It's also what can start to happen when you get toward the end of writing an opera. It's as though musical seeds you planted in the beginning bear fruit. This aria is based on the music that first introduced Jan on her front porch on Telegraph Hill, contemplating the night sky. The harmony repeats 3 times. The voice fights against the repetition, then finally gives into it. Now we're coming to the end of the opera. Time passes. John is frozen in isolation. Liz and Phil have a new baby, and they send a letter to John asking him to be the godfather. In the novel, the very last action is John opening the letter and reading it.
He hesitates a minute, eyeing the script, then reads on. When he's done, his chest is tight and he is crying. It says,
Dear John, we have a son. We hope you'll be his godfather. We've called him John. We would much rather have you than any other friend. Please speak to us, John. In the end, we'll all be old or dead or dying. My mother died 2 weeks ago. We thought perhaps you might not know. Phil and I send our love. Liz.
Sighing a harsh, prolonged, exhausted breath, John feels his heart revisit death. Depleted by his pain, he slowly walks to Jan's desk. What did not last in life has now possessed him wholly. Nothing can mitigate the past.
He gently touches Jan's sand dollar. It soothes him in the ache, the squalor that is his life, and she seems near him once again. And he can hear her voice, can almost hear her saying, I'm with you, John. You're not alone. Trust me, my friend. There is the phone. It isn't me you are obeying. Pay what are your own heart's arrears. Now, clear your throat and dry these tears.
And we say goodbye to John at that moment. End of novel. Will he struggle out of his isolation or remain frozen in it, maybe for the rest of his life? It's exactly parallel to the ending of the Golden Gates model, Pushkin's Eugene Onegin. Onegin has been rejected by the woman he realized too late he truly loved. He's left alone in the room as the woman's husband approaches. Whatever the rest of his life will be, this moment will be the fulcrum of it. And that's when Pushkin says goodbye. Dealing with the ending of the opera has been a lesson for me in how different stage time is from novel time. Is it enough for John to hear Jan's voice as a disembodied presence and not react to it? Not on stage. Is it enough for John to be poised with his hand over the phone? Let me tell you, it did not work in the first of about 20 versions of the end of the opera that I wrote. With the brilliant help of my production team, director John Henry Davis, conductor Stephen Osgood, and workshop producer Emma Lively, we came up with a very different order of final events and even invented a new action to bring the opera to a dramatic close. As in other spots, lines from 10 different places in the novel are rearranged to make this new flow. There's even text from the very beginning of the opera and the novel, now seen in a very different light. Vikram was wonderfully understanding and has been wholeheartedly behind these changes. In our ending, John can't deal with the letter, and he can't accept the words he imagines Jan telling him. He runs out into the nighttime city, and at daybreak he finds himself at the bay, where he sees Liz, Phil, Ed, and the new baby watching Paul fly a kite. The kite falls at John's feet, and Paul runs to him. John just stands there, frozen in indecision. Paul returns to the embrace of his family. Then all celebrate the bay and the bridge arching over it. Slowly and with great effort, John begins to walk toward his friends. What you're going to see next is Vikram Seth reading the stanza, actually from much earlier in the novel, that becomes the opera's finale. We'll follow that by the finale of the opera, and that will be our goodbye. Thank you to our wonderful readers, to Shelley Fisher-Fishkin, to the Department of English, the Creative Writing Program, the American Studies Program, the Stanford Art Institute, and to all the sponsors of From Lyric Novel to Lyric Stage.
They wander for a while, not saying too much, then stroll out on the pier by Old Fort Point. Surfers, displaying sinuous equestrianism, steer their boards on the in-pouring rollers. On shore, the 8-year-old controllers of motley skateboards swiftly skim in competition bright and trim past fishermen, gulls, rocks, and breakers, while high above the Golden Gate, nestling the fort in unornate magnificence across the acres of white-capped sea, the golden span hangs for the world to him and scan.
I'm with you, John. You're not alone. Trust me, my friend. There is the phone. It's dark, it's late November. The streetlights glimmer through cooling air. The glimmer of light shines out across the water. The loveliest city in the world. The unforgiving realization of my own love. I'm with you, John. The taut emotion of guilt and panic seizing my heart. Trust me, my friend. Somehow I played a part in your death. There is the phone. And I'm ineligible to share your dying. It isn't me you are obeying. My despaired and dented brain. Hey, what are your own thoughts of me? If I died, who'd be sad? Who'd weep? Who would be glad?
Did you see? It went straight up.